A monarchy can survive wars, it can survive rebellions, it can survive scandals, assassinations, collapsing empires, entire centuries of people praying for it to fail. But sometimes, it almost doesn't survive something much smaller. One man, one appetite, one obsession that turned the crown into a hostage situation. Because the truth is, the British monarchy didn't nearly collapse from bombs or armies. It nearly collapsed from a king who wanted to be loved more than he wanted to be responsible. And the part most people get wrong is this: it wasn't what happened during his reign that makes him dangerous, it's what happened after. The lies, the resentment, the politics, the alliances, the way he kept trying to pull the institution back into his orbit like a parasite that refused to die quietly. And it all starts with one of the weirdest details about him. His name wasn't even Edward, not really. He was born on June 23rd, 1894, to the future King George V and Queen Mary. His official name was a royal nightmare, the kind you only give a child if you want him to grow up thinking paperwork is power. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. Yes, that's real. No, you don't have to memorize it. The people closest to him just called him David. And that small detail matters later because it explains something uncomfortable. From childhood, he had two lives: the public one and the private one he thought he could protect forever. Now, royal childhoods are supposed to be polished: nannies, tutors, strict routines, a kind of cold perfection that's meant to produce a stable adult. But in David's case, it produced something else, because he carried a story with him that made people look at him differently once it came out. His nanny, the woman paid to care for him. Some accounts say she was possessive, even cruel, that she'd pinch him right before he was brought to see his parents so he'd cry, so he'd cling to her, so he'd look like he needed her more than he needed anyone else. And when he finally told on her, she was removed. But by then, the damage was already baked in. Here's the question: if you grow up learning that love is something you can manipulate, what do you become? A romantic or a professional user? Because the monarchy had other problems. This boy was adored, good looking, charming, modern, the kind of prince newspapers could sell like a product. And on his 16th birthday, his father made it official. David became the Prince of Wales, the heir, the future, and everyone applauded because that's what you do when a teenager gets handed a destiny he didn't earn. But behind palace walls, people were already worried because he wasn't built for duty, not even close. He wanted the navy at one point. He wanted excitement, movement, attention. What he got instead was the royal grooming process, the education, the training, the endless preparation for the most ceremonial job in Europe. So they sent him to Oxford. And it went about as well as you'd expect when you take a young man with global fame, unlimited access, and a taste for mischief, and ask him to behave like a quiet student. He liked polo more than study, friends more than discipline, parties more than books. And when his time there ended, it wasn't a triumph, it was a warning. He wasn't serious. And the thing about monarchies is that they can forgive scandal. What they cannot forgive is unpredictability. Then World War I arrives, and David wants to be seen as a war prince. He wants frontline credibility. The government, terrified of the heir being captured or killed, blocks him from real combat. So he does what he can. He visits trenches, he tours the front, he watches the suffering at a safe distance. And some people respected that. But war does something else too. It teaches you what you can get away with. And David learned quickly that he could get away with a lot. Because whenever he had to leave, he didn't go home to reflect or train. He went out. He chased pleasure like it was medicine. And that's where he started developing a type. Not just women, married women. Women with danger baked into them. Women who came with consequences because he liked consequences when they didn't fall on him. At one point in the early 1920s, he's linked to a glamorous courtesan named Margaret Alibert. And later, that woman becomes the center of a scandal when her husband is shot and killed at a London hotel. Suddenly, the prince's private life is no longer private, and the palace machine goes into panic mode. Because the monarchy doesn't just protect the air, it protects the illusion that the air is clean. But here's the problem. David wasn't clean. He was just protected. And that protection made him arrogant. By the 1920s, he's an international celebrity. He tours. Crowds love him. The press loves him. Men copy his clothes. Women idolize him. He becomes a symbol of modern royalty. A king in waiting who looks like he belongs in the new century. But if you listened closely, the people around him weren't cheering. They were bracing. Because his father, George V, wasn't blind. George V reportedly had a brutal prediction that after he died, David would ruin him so quickly. And the chilling part is not that a father had said something harsh. It's that a king said it like a security assessment. Because he knew his son, and he knew the monarchy cannot survive a king who treats the crown like a stage. Then, David meets the woman who turns all of that into a crisis. Wallis Simpson. American. Divorced once already. Married again to a businessman named Ernest Simpson. And Wallis didn't behave like other women around royals. She wasn't reverent. She wasn't starstruck. She didn't treat him like a sacred object. She treated him like a man. And that, for someone like David, was addictive. At first, their relationship builds quietly. Flirtations, dinner parties, a slow drift into something more intense. And while it's happening, David is still entangled in other affairs. He's still the same man. Just now he's found the one woman who makes him feel like he's not royal, like he's not trapped, like he's not expected to be anything except obsessed. And obsession is the word here, because once it begins, it escalates fast. Within a short time, he isn't just seeing Wallis, he's arranging his life around her. He's bending the palace routine around her. He's becoming, in the simplest terms, dependent. Now, the palace tries to shut it down. Wallis is the wrong kind of woman for a future king. Not because she's evil, because she's politically impossible. The Church of England doesn't approve of divorce. The government doesn't want a twice divorced American as queen. The monarchy doesn't want to normalize the idea that a king can rewrite the rules because he's in love. So the royal family freezes her out. They refuse to accept her. They refuse to meet her properly. They treated her like a contaminant. And if you think that will make David reconsider, you don't understand him. Being told no didn't discipline him, it dared him. Then comes January 1936. George V dies. David becomes king. Edward VIII. And the moment he takes the throne, the nightmare becomes real. Because now it's not the prince is behaving badly. Now it's the king is behaving dangerously. And almost immediately he sends a message to the government that terrifies them. He refuses to play the role the way they expect. He's impatient, dismissive. He doesn't like the red boxes, the official documents, the daily grind of constitutional monarchy. He wants emotion. He wants control. He wants the crown to bend towards his personal life. not the other way around. And then he makes it worse by refusing to separate from Wallis. He insists on having her close. He's seen with her constantly. People whisper, ministers panic, because the monarchy is not just a family, it's a state mechanism. And the state mechanism is now being dragged by the throat into a romance it cannot afford. This is the part Americans don't always get, so here's the clean version. In Britain, the monarch is not just a celebrity symbol. He's part of the constitutional structure. He's tied to the church. He's tied to tradition. He's tied to the idea of stability. So if he marries someone the system rejects, it's not just gossip. It's a fracture. And fractures spread. Now, Edward tries to force the issue. Wallis begins divorce proceedings. And Edward tells the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, that he intends to marry her. He thinks the government will grumble and accept it. He thinks his popularity will make the system fold. He thinks this is a negotiation. It isn't. It's a constitutional crisis, because the government has to think bigger than Edward's feelings. If he marries Wallis and she becomes queen, the church looks compromised. If he marries her against government advice, the government can resign, triggering political chaos. If he insists on a compromise marriage where she's not queen, the Dominions have to agree too, because this isn't just Britain, it's an empire with multiple governments watching. And they weren't interested in playing along with the king's romantic fantasy. So Baldwin gives him 3 options, and none of them are pretty. Give her up, marry her and blow up the system, or step aside. Edward thinks he can outstubborn everyone. He can't, because the monarchy's power is not in stubbornness, it's in consent. And the moment that consent weakens, the whole thing is exposed. The press begins circling, the whispers become headlines, the private obsession becomes national news, and suddenly Edward has to choose between the crown and the woman who makes him feel alive. This is the moment history likes to romanticize. The king who gave up everything for love, the ultimate gesture, the tragic sacrifice. But watch what happens when you remove the poetry. He didn't sacrifice, he escaped. Because duty suffocated him, and Wallis gave him an excuse to run. So, in December 1936, Edward signs the abdication papers. He steps down. He gives the throne to his brother, Albert, who becomes George VI. And Edward goes on the radio and makes his famous point that he can't carry the burden of kingship without the woman he loves. People hear romance, the government hears relief, the royal family hears betrayal, and the monarchy hears something colder, a precedent, a king who proved he would choose himself. Now you'd think that's the end. King abdicates, love story begins, everyone moves on. But this is where the real danger starts. Because Edward doesn't leave quietly, he leaves resentful. And resentment in a former king is not harmless, it's a political weapon. In 1937, he marries Wallis in France, not in Britain, not with royal blessings, and the entire royal family refuses to attend, not even as a courtesy, not even as optics. They isolate him. And that isolation hardens into something bitter that lasts decades. Edward is given a title, Duke of Windsor. It sounds glamorous, but it is also a cage, because it gives him status without power. And the royal family adds one more punishment. Wallis is not granted the style, Her Royal Highness. She becomes Duchess of Windsor, yes, but never HRH, which sounds like a detail until you understand what Edward wanted most. Validation, recognition, a public stamp that his choice was legitimate. They refuse to give it. So he stews, he calls, he pressures, he complains, he demands money, he demands respect. He demands his place. But the monarchy, now under George VI, is terrified of him because a former king with a grudge is a threat, and they treat him accordingly. They exile him socially, they restrict him financially, they keep him out, and the tension becomes a kind of cold civil war within the family. Edward lashes out at his mother, at his brother, at the institution. He writes cruel letters, he says unforgivable things, and in the background, the world is shifting toward the next catastrophe. The late 1930s. Fascism rising, Europe on edge, and then Edward and Wallis do the thing that brands them permanently. They travel to Nazi Germany. They meet Adolf Hitler. They tour. They smile. They salute. They behave like naive aristocrats sightseeing through a regime that was already showing the world what it was. And the British government is horrified because it confirms their worst fear. Edward is not just irresponsible, he's politically reckless. And worse, he's flattered by the wrong people. Hitler reportedly admired Edward, saw him as a potential ally, a useful symbol, someone who could have been a bridge between Britain and Nazi Germany if he'd remained on the throne. Now, to be clear, history here gets messy. Some people argue Edward was just ignorant. Some people argue he was sympathetic. Some argue he was vain and easily influenced, which might be the most dangerous version of all. Because a vain man doesn't need ideology to be used. He just needs attention. And Edward loved attention. Then World War II breaks out. And now the government has a real problem. A former king living abroad, with Nazi connections hovering around him like smoke. So they do what governments do. They neutralize him. They give him a job far away. Edward is appointed governor of the Bahamas. A colonial posting that sounds prestigious until you realize what it is. A relocation. A leash. A way to keep him out of European politics and out of German reach. But even then, rumors swirl about German interest in him. About attempts to lure him back, about schemes to use him as a pawn. There was even a Nazi plan discussed in intelligence circles that involved persuading and possibly pressuring the Duke of Windsor into cooperation. The logic was simple. If you can control a former king, you can contaminate the legitimacy of the current one. And that is how institutions fall. Not from invasion, from internal doubt. This is why Edward isn't just a scandal figure. He's a structural threat, because even after abdication, he remained a symbol that could be weaponized, and he never fully accepted the consequences of his own choice. After the war, Edward and Wallis settle into a strange existence. They live in luxury, but it's a luxury with a ceiling. They attend parties, but they are never fully home. They are famous, but always slightly radioactive. They are treated like celebrities, but not like royals. Edward's identity becomes a loop. Former king, man who abdicated, husband of Wallis, and privately, he never stops feeling wronged. As the decades pass, the glamour fades into routine. The body ages, the power evaporates. Edward's health collapses slowly. Smoking, illness, surgeries, weakness, and by the early 1970s, he's visibly nearing the end. In 1972, Queen Elizabeth II visits him in France. A brief encounter, a controlled image, a quiet gesture of family diplomacy. And shortly after, Edward dies. Throat cancer, May 28, 1972. He's returned to Britain in death, because even if the monarchy didn't want him in life, it could not leave him abroad forever. He is buried at Frogmore near Windsor, among the royal dead. And then comes the final irony. Wallis outlives him for years, but she doesn't thrive. She becomes reclusive, her health declines, her world shrinks into silence. She dies in 1986, and she's buried beside him. The woman who won the king ends up in the same ground, under the same sky, as the institution that never fully accepted her. And if you're tempted to call this romantic, pause, because here's what the story really is: a man born into privilege, trained for power, and adored by the public, who treated his role like an inconvenience. He didn't just fall in love, he fell into obsession. And then he forced an ancient institution to either bend with him or break against him. It chose not to bend, and that choice saved the monarchy. But it also changed it, because after Edward, the monarchy becomes colder, tighter, more controlled, more suspicious of emotion, because they learned the lesson the hard way. You cannot allow personal appetite to drive the crown. Now, there's one last detail people bring up when they talk about Edward's character. A detail that strips away romance and leaves something uglier. His younger brother, Prince John, a child with severe epilepsy, kept mostly out of public view because the royal family was obsessed with appearances. John dies in 1919 at 13, and accounts from letters suggest Edward's reaction was disturbingly cold. Not grief, not shock, detachment. Language that reads more like irritation than loss. And whether every quote you hear about it is perfectly preserved or partly embellished by retelling, the shape of the truth remains. He could be ruthless. He could be emotionally vacant. He could reduce even tragedy to inconvenience. And if that's who he was as a brother, imagine who he was as a king. This is why his story isn't a fairy tale. It's not he sacrificed everything for love. He nearly sacrificed the institution for himself. And the institution survived him by doing what institutions always do. It removed the unstable piece. It protected the machine. And it spent the rest of the century making sure nothing like him ever happened again. So when you hear the abdication story, don't just hear romance. Hear the panic underneath it, the cabinet meetings, the church pressure, the fear of a crown turning into a personal toy. Because in that moment, the monarchy wasn't choosing between a man and a woman. It was choosing between emotion and survival. And it chose survival. If you want more stories where the powerful almost collapsed their own world, subscribe and comment which one you want next. Because these aren't just old stories, they're warnings with better costumes.